Good morning, everyone. Try and get near the reading the book. All right, we're on the appendix. This is effectiveness of propaganda. Approaching the problem of gauging propaganda results, we must carefully distinguish between effectiveness and involuntary effects. On the one hand, the propagandist aims at certain objectives. He wants to modify the content of an opinion, change majority views, or destroy the morale of an enemy. With regard to such aims, we can speak of effectiveness. Either the propagandist attains his objective or he does not. This is what people usually study under the subject heading propaganda effects. But this is a misconception, for other effects are much deeper and more important, even though not willed. I've tried to analyze these in chapters 4 and 5. In this appendix, I will limit myself to examining direct effectiveness. 1. The difficulties of measuring effectiveness. As soon as we pose the problem of effectiveness, we approach the question of effects and the measurement of such effects in this annex. I will take the word in its ordinary sense, as it is generally used by students of propaganda, i.e., desired effects sought by the propagandist. Can the propagandist change an opinion, or can't he? This is what some people try to measure, because in line with contemporary scientific prejudices, only what can be expressed in figures is certain. Difficulty of the subject. Let us begin by stating that propaganda sets itself a great diversity of objectives, and that it is often difficult to distinguish among them. The propagandist may seek to sustain the morale of his troops, to reinforce their courage, to excite them, to get them to sacrifice their lives. The existence of other propagandas and the difficulty of measurement will combine here to make it impossible to know and register the point of departure, i.e., the degree of enthusiasm, and so on, before and after the propaganda operation. It must be particularly stressed that, aside from the question... It must be particularly stressed that aside from the difficulty of finding reliable testing methods, the individuals in question were not untouched by propaganda in general before a particular operation was launched. For instance, mobilized troops already have been propagandized to some extent. We cannot find a 0 point from which to begin, not only because none of us has remained immune to propaganda, but also because supporters of a cause have become supporters through propaganda. From there on, mere modifications in consequence of propaganda of a propaganda campaign are of little significance. A propagandist might also aim at neutralizing an enemy by destroying his morale, but to measure the effectiveness of such propaganda would require measuring the difference between two propagandas, for the enemy also is subjected to positive propaganda by his own side, and it is never possible to evaluate the effects of two propagandas at the same time. No nation or organization can undertake such analysis at the time of the propaganda operation. There can only be retrospective inquiries, and we shall see later how insignificant they are. The propagandist can aim at some external, formal, and temporary adherence, as in an election campaign, by trying to get undecided voters to vote for a certain candidate. Okay. At this point, we generally encounter the traditional argument that because two or three conflicting propagandas cancel each other out, the voter is free to make his own choice. In the event of a referendum, there are as many arguments for as against In the event of a referendum, there are as many arguments for as against advanced everywhere. Therefore, if it is maintained, no opinions are changed. This is only partially correct, and one cannot reach decisive conclusions as to propaganda effectiveness in general by noting the success or failure of an election campaign. The shift of some votes is never significant. In fact, one cannot really talk about propaganda in connection with an election campaign. A campaign is the simplest, most imperfect form of modern propaganda. The objective is insufficient. The methods are incomplete. The duration is brief. Pre-propaganda is absent. And the campaign propagandist never has all the media at his disposal. Thus, the one case in which the measurement of effects is comparatively easy, shift of votes, is also by far the least significant. The propagandist may also aim at many other objectives, such as the destruction of microgroups, labor unions, associations, and other groups. He may seek some determined action, strike, boycott, pogrom? I don't know what that is. Pogrom? He might seek some determined action from a group more or less directly under his influence. He may seek to influence some public opinion, aiming not at immediate actions, but only at changing a climate or evoking an atmosphere of sympathy or antipathy. He may, finally, if he is a commercial propagandist, simply try to get people to buy some product. I have pointed out the extreme diversity of possible objectives in order to show that propaganda's effectiveness cannot be measured on the basis of results obtained in one of these domains. If I look at propaganda made within a large group and find that it has failed to push the group towards some proposed action, a strike for example, I will be tempted to conclude that it was ineffective. But if I find that this same propaganda campaign has broken up some of an adversary's microgroups, or has created some strong resentment and restrained aggressiveness on the part of the group of militants, I must conclude that from this point of view, propaganda has succeeded and can serve as a basis for future action. If I see that few votes were won and that the undecided were not reached by the campaign, I will tend to regard it as a failure. But the same propaganda may have galvanized the militant group, reinforced the party, given it a chance to experiment with new methods, or lead to the solidarity of certain microgroups, equally important results. Therefore, given the diversity of effects sought by the propagandist, one can draw absolutely no conclusion about the effectiveness of his propaganda with regard to any of his objectives. Moreover, even if one could isolate one from among the many and prove that the propagandist aimed only at that particular one, for example, to obtain votes in a referendum, it is absolutely impossible to transfer such findings to other domains of propaganda. To do so would be hasty and to misunderstand basic differences. It has been well recognized, for example, that certain advertising methods are ineffective in political propaganda. Getting a man to adhere to a political movement and getting him to buy a car are not the same problem. Nor is it the same problem to get people to vote a certain way or to promote heroism in combat. It has also been clearly demonstrated that propaganda directed toward other countries cannot be the same as propaganda made at home. The techniques of exercising influence will be different, as will the methods of measuring effectiveness. It should be added that it is impossible to measure the effectiveness of black propaganda through unconventional channels or rumors. Also, to measure propaganda, it would be necessary to demand criteria of obvious effectiveness. Daniel Lerner has tried this without much success. Finally, a direct correlation would have to be established between the effects and the means, which is practically impossible. Aside from the complexity of the problem itself, the extreme difficulty of defining the facts themselves must also be taken into account. Even on the simplest level, most easily translated into figures, one cannot determine with any degree of accuracy how many people are being reached by a propaganda campaign. We know the efforts made by some American services after 1944 to determine how many German soldiers had read American leaflets, but the number remained completely uncertain. We also know Laswell's effort to determine how many persons were reached by communist propaganda in Chicago. Despite his use of a very complicated method, the results are completely unreliable. This is also true for Rossi's figures regarding communist propaganda in France. But if we do not even know how many people are subjected to propaganda, on the simplest level by counting a single medium, leaflets, or meetings, or the circulation figures of a newspaper, we certainly cannot estimate the quantitative effect of propaganda because we cannot learn the percentage of people reached as compared with the total population, or the percentage of people affected as compared with the total number reached. Therefore, we can have no solid basis for evaluation. When we leave this most elementary sphere of attempts at evaluation, we encounter even greater difficulties. The question becomes complicated from 4 points of view. First of all, propaganda tends to affect people in depth, and not just with respect to certain circumscribed actions. How, then, can we measure an entire situation, particularly if the effects are latent? A second difficulty is the delay, not always the same duration, between the moment when the propagandist acts and the one when certain effects begin to show. Dube maintains that we see here a period of indetermination. Obviously, the propagandist's task is to reduce this period of indetermination as much as possible, but he cannot eliminate it, and the student of propaganda effects must take it into account. He must never answer this question: At what point can one say that propaganda has failed? I.e., at what point has opinion emerged from the period of indetermination to take a direction different from that suggested by propaganda? This question is hard to answer. A third problem concerns the payoff. Propaganda becomes increasingly expensive. Therefore, the question inevitably arises, do the results justify the costs? Are the returns worth the game? I think is this supposed to be gain? Do constantly rising costs produce increased results? What is the optimal level? These three questions concerning the returns of propaganda efforts demand an answer, but we are far from being able to answer them. The question of returns is also asked in the USSR, but under a different aspect. The cost of propaganda there is established in terms of the contribution that the propaganda media can make to the effective administration of the country by the party. As a result, the problem of money is of less importance. Okay, the fourth difficulty derives from the propagandist's need to predict effects. Effects must be gauged beforehand because propaganda must be directed and adjusted if maximum results are to be obtained. But are we barely able to see past effects about which nothing can be done any longer? This is all the more serious because propaganda consists of holding the masses in hand in order to steer them in various directions. When we find on the basis of past effects that some propaganda is failing, that means that it has already failed, that the masses, failing to respond, have escaped it, and propaganda can no longer recapture them. This happened with communist propaganda in France between 1949 and 1952. The masses ceased to obey, and the party's self-criticism came too late. The same holds true for the psychological action in Algeria. Its failure became apparent only in 1960. The difficulty of evaluating propaganda effects is increased by the social interactions in which propaganda unfolds. Dube has taken devilish pleasure in enumerating them. His definition of these interactions: all propagandists are influenced by the public opinion they seek to influence. Interest provokes propaganda, but propaganda provokes an interest. Propaganda provokes habitual responses, which are reinforced or modified by the simple fact of being evoked by propaganda. The individual perceives only that propaganda that his personality lets him perceive, but his personality is changed by that propaganda. The propagandist is influenced by public opinion and by preceding propaganda action. Propaganda is influenced by the propagandist, by public opinion, and by the perception of an individual has of that propaganda. But the perception itself is influenced by propaganda, public opinion, and the personality of the man who perceives it. Such interactions, which make it impossible to isolate a single propaganda effect in its pure state, can easily be manipulated or multiplied. Continuing in the same direction, we must understand that it is impossible to dissociate propaganda effects from other factors. As I pointed out in Chapter 1, we cannot name every factor working upon an individual. It would be wrong even to attempt this, for propaganda is not an isolated phenomenon with clearly delineated boundaries. It is completely integrated and immersed in a social entity. It is related to the general sociological structure, and to try to disassociate it and reduce it to its pure state would be to strip it of its true nature. Let us consider a final difficulty. It is particularly impossible to study propaganda effects exactly where they are made, in the society in which they develop. The sociologist or psychologist absolutely cannot work in the living, contemporary environment of an intense propaganda because this environment is much too polarized and activated for an analysis to be possible. Just as it is not possible to make public opinion surveys or complicated psychological observations during a battle, so one cannot make them in this kind of psychological war, which all propaganda is. It was completely impossible to research propaganda effectiveness in fascist or Nazi societies. Such research would have been suspect, and the results could not have been published. Such efforts would have been collided not only with the resistance of the authorities, but also that with the interested parties, who either would not be affected by the propaganda and therefore hostile to the regime, without daring to say so in the course of sociological investigation, or would be partisans to the regime. This is the situation in all countries where true propaganda is being made, such as China and the USSR, Algeria, and so on. The researcher is therefore forced to limit himself to an analyst in real-life situations in which there is no real propaganda, or only limited or sporadic propaganda in connection with an election campaign, a referendum, or a minority party trying to gain members. One could still try to measure effects a posteriori, but such measurement is necessarily inexact. Finally, one could conduct tests, and this will be discussed next in detail. Because he says one could still try to measure effects a posteriori, but such measurement is necessarily inexact. For example, as long as one cannot interrogate Nazis in Germany, one will interrogate prisoners. So you only get the story from prisoners and not from the people in Nazi Germany. I guess I'll just take a break there and feed my cat. He's a beast.